It's just $10 a month, very low. Then once we put that in, I think it was maybe 2 weeks, paid $10. The first $10 that I made on the internet made me feel so incredible. You really get addicted to that. We try at Pickaxe, our main goal, I think the primary thing we hope to provide is we want to learn with people and educate and help people to understand. Go on Reddit and just don't even necessarily just talk about your product, just be a part of the conversation in the community where people are asking questions about what you're the type of thing you're building.
Okay, let's get started. Nathaniel, let's talk about you and your company. So could you please introduce about yourself?
Well, I run a company called Pickaxe, and what we do at Pickaxe is we help small and medium-sized consultants, coaching organizations, educational organizations to basically like build their own ChatGPT and put that in the hands of their clients. So if you're like maybe doing consulting and in the past you just leave your client with a deck that they're never probably going to read or look at, now you can leave them with kind of a box of agents, of AI agents, that then they're going to use in an ongoing way, and they might even pay you to use them in perpetuity, forever.
Okay, so I want to know about it. If I have a small agency, work with like local startups, so I can give some decks, but my clients are so busy, they don't check my deck. So that I can use your product, a Pickaxe, small agent, like a mini version of me. They can say, hey, please check my deck, like that. They speak. Could you please tell us some example?
Well, yeah, you make a great case study. Maybe you go in and you work with a startup and maybe you find that they're completely messing up a part of their process. Maybe it's their branding, right? And so you say to them, hey, I spent some time with you. I learned all of this about your branding. You need to do stuff differently, and here's what you need to do differently. Maybe you put that into a deck, but they're probably not really going to read that as much. What you might want to do, everybody's using these AI tools. Maybe you put it into almost like a little AI assistant, and then when they have a question about branding, they'll ask that, and it'll give your perspective from everything you learned. And so that can be really cool because instead of it just being this passive document, it's an active thing that is voicing what you would have said to them if you were there, if that makes sense.
I see. Okay. Why did you come up with this idea, Nathaniel?
Well, it's an interesting situation. I was working on a completely different startup idea in September, August of 2022, if you can believe it. ChatGPT had not launched, right? But they did have this GPT-3 DaVinci, right? But it was just an API, so not that many people knew about that. But I stumbled across it. I was working at the time at a group called ArcInvest with Kathy Wood, and we were looking at lots of new innovative technology, and I stumbled across this new technology, and the startup that I was working on all of a sudden seemed stupid.
Stupid? Okay.
Because it seemed that this new AI would just build it, it would be so easy to make it with this new AI. So then I thought, well, if it would be easy to make the startup that I was building with this new AI, probably it would be easy to make a lot of startups with this new AI. And maybe the best thing to do would be to build something that helps people build businesses on top of this new technology. So we started, and the very first thing we did, we put out this tool just a very simple tool that helped people make a cover letter for applying to a job. They put in their information and it would write them this cover letter. And this is before ChatGPT came out, and we posted it for free. We put it out there, and people would, we got this one email that I'll never forget. And this woman was like, I say she was crying, but she was crying in the email. She was like, I never felt like I could express myself before this. I got the job because of you. And so I said, oh my God, this is really helping people. We have to build more here. And this thing about helping consultants with these agents is something that came after working with lots of organizations. We worked with people in Hollywood. We worked with people doing research. We work with big businesses. We work with really small businesses. And finally, we kind of realized that this group was the most exciting to us because we think there's going to be, in the world of AI that's coming soon, a lot more people who work for themselves, who quit their jobs and become consultants, independent consultants, and we think that we want to build a tool for those people.
I see. Okay, at that time, when you made a product, it's a open model, open source, right? Open source to help cover letter, making a cover letter.
Well, we made it free. It wasn't. I don't know if I would call it open source. But we didn't even know how to charge for it. So we didn't charge for it because we weren't sophisticated enough to figure that out.
I see, but the wonderful experimentation was game changer in your life, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It was just not knowing what you're going to do, but experimenting. And the important thing is not just to experiment, but to put it out there, tell people about it, ask people to try it on Reddit or on Product Hunt or in other places. People might just jump in and try it.
I see. And then, so after this wonderful game-changing moment, did you quit the previous company immediately and you started to Pickaxe?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I dropped the previous company pretty much immediately and went to work on this new idea.
Okay, so let's talk about your first customer, your paid customer. Because I know many startup founders, they love to build, but they are not good at to get paid customers. So could you please share us your first paid customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just preface this by saying this advice, this story, other people would give different advice. So different things work for different people. But for us, what we did, because we didn't really know, we were just exploring, we had a free product. And we put it out there for free. And we waited and watched people use it. And once we saw enough people were kind of using it, we were like, okay. Then we went through the work of putting in a payment wall, but we said it's just $10 a month. Very low. Then once we put that in, I think it was maybe 2 weeks, and somebody just paid. And I will never forget where I was. I was in Florida. I was on the street, and I got this notification that this guy, he was a real estate consultant in Alaska who had found us on Reddit, paid $10. The first $10 that I made on the internet made me feel so incredible. You really get addicted to that. And so, some people will say, I think the YC advice is, don't charge too little, charge a lot, because then you'll know that what you're providing is valuable. But from what we found, I'll tell you that what you're providing is not valuable at the beginning. I guarantee it. So make it free, get people to use it. Charge less, but so charge a little bit, get people to use it, double the price. Only through that iteration of working with people will you end up having something that's valuable enough to charge a lot for. This is at least my perspective.
I agree with you because of, for example, if I have food business, first, maybe experimentation. I made a cookie, matcha cookie. Could you please try it? Free
Right.
trial, and then making a kind of fun of our cookie, right? And then next, like maybe like $5, like that. And then if people like our product, people can share on their social media. And then, okay, not only individual people, company want to buy our cookie for their event. Okay, like it's time to like next to other price like that.
Yes, land and expand strategy. Even if you're doing an enterprise sales company and you think everything I'm saying is wrong, no, actually, get individuals to use the product for free, get enough of them in an organization, and that organization will approach you and say, we need to sign an enterprise contract with you because we have data security or whatever, even if it's a completely free product. And you know what the other really good thing about it is even if it needs to change a lot, you know, before you can really charge for it, if people are using it for free and they like it, you're putting good into the world, you know, and that makes you feel good, and that's a good thing to do, even if you're not making a lot of money yet.
I love that, like step by step. It is a process to achieve the like milestone or big success. Yeah. So you mentioned in order to get the first paid customer, you guys used Reddit and Product Hunt, not a Facebook group. What do you think?
Well, later on, we did use Facebook groups a bit. Facebook groups can be a good way to get folks. I think overall, Reddit is just the most amazing place. Still, we get a lot of folks from Reddit, and we try to have sincere and honest conversations on there about, you know, we try at Pickaxe. Our main goal, I think the primary thing we hope to provide is we want to learn with people and educate and help people to understand. And so, you know, if you're out there and you're in a space and you're building a product, go on Reddit and just don't even necessarily just talk about your product, just be a part of the conversation in the community where people are asking questions about what the type of thing you're building, and eventually, you know, you will have a great product and people will find out about it from places like Reddit.
I agree with you. Thank you so much. By the way, didn't you do cold reach email to like potential clients?
We found that cold outreach emails did not work for us at all. We were never able to get them to work so far. We might be able to get them to work in the future, but having an affiliate program, having people refer the product to their friends, way more powerful than us trying to reach out and do cold outreach, because it feels gross, honestly, to do the cold outreach. Nobody wants to be bothered about something. It's way better for somebody to have a need, and as soon as they pick their head up to look around for a solution to their problem, that's when you want to be there. And if you've built a really awesome product, you have good SEO, you have a good network of customers who will refer an affiliate, then as soon as they pick their head up and say, I want this, they'll find your product.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Nathaniel, part 1. 1. Don't just give your clients a deck. Give them a smart AI assistant. Instead of handing clients a PDF or presentation they will never open, Pickaxe lets consultants and small agencies build their own ChatGPT-like agent, like a mini you. For instance, if you are a branding consultant, you can build a custom AI agent that speaks with your insights. Your client can ask questions anytime, and you keep adding value long after the project ends. 2. Start free, charge small, and iterate. Your $10 moment matters. Nathaniel's first paid customer was a real estate consultant in Alaska who found Pickaxe via Reddit. They paid just $10, but it was unforgettable. like baking cookies for friends before opening a bakery. Free experiments help you refine your product. Start small. Learn from users. Then slowly raise your price. You build value with your customers. 3. Skip cold emails. Grow through real communications and referrals. Instead of spamming inbox, Nathaniel built trust on Reddit product hunt by answering questions, sharing tools, and being part of the conversation. Growth happened with people find you because they trust you, not because you focused your pitch. Affiliate programs, real testimonials, and helpful content build more momentum than cold outreach. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope this conversation will help your future and career. And next episode is the conversation with Nathaniel Part 2. Please stay tuned. If you like it, please subscribe us and give your like. Thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。